present.
So, I hate shushing, but shh.
All rise.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you. I want to start off by saying thank you so much for being here. Okay, it's so important that you're here to be supporting these events. So thank you for that. Students of ours, of course, external guests as well. Thank you for being here today. And for those who are joining us online, hello as well in the land of YouTube. Can I begin with our onliners and say that we don't have the capacity to monitor your questions this evening. But if you email, jot this down and I'll remind you again later, email radio@bill.ac.uk. Any questions you may have. I'm sure Victoria and myself will have no problem answering those questions over the coming days. That's radio@bill.ac.uk. Thank you. So, welcome to Bloomsbury Dialogues number 2. We had number 1, of course, with Erifili Unari. We had a great session with Erifili, who I believe is online. Hi, Erifili. And today we have Dr. Victoria McCloud. So, a round of applause, please, for our special guest. And can I just say, Victoria has come straight from ITV Studios to be with us here at Bloomsbury Institute. This morning she was with Richard Madeley.
Yes, in the old BBC building, which was the most exciting historic building.
And well done with that, because anybody who can, no offence Richard Madeley, but anybody who can handle that can handle it. You can certainly handle me after that. I do love Richard, of course, deeply. So, look, I'm going to begin by saying that, you know, when Victoria agreed to come to Bloomsbury Institute to talk to us, the Supreme Court decision hadn't happened.
No.
So in that time, of course, the landscape has completely changed, and it is something that we are going to discuss, because I know you want to discuss it. But before we begin, just a reminder to people online and people in the room that the discussion around this, wherever you sit in the discussion around this, is that I think it'd be really lovely if we listen to each other in our conversations, our opinions, and we deal with it in a real kind of calm and compassionate way, which society doesn't always do with this particular debate. So let's show the rest of the world how this can be discussed, if you like, going forward. But before we get into that, I really want to, Victoria, I want to rewind. We have law students in the room, and we need to talk about your career. How did you get into law? Why law? How did it all begin? And how did you become a High Court judge? Can we have all of that in the space of about 10 minutes?
I have to start from the end in the sense that technically I was a judge in the High Court. I wasn't a High Court judge because a High Court judge is a technical term. I was run down from that. I'm still a judge in the High Court. But there are only about 180 High Court judges, whereas there are only about 9 of my type, so I like to think that's even better. But technically more junior. So we were a subset of judges. We would deal with civil work exclusively, so no crime, no family. And luckily for us, we didn't have to travel around the country because if you're a full High Court judge, there's only so many of them, and you actually travel around the country hearing murders and what have you, whereas actually we stayed put, so we actually had the better job. But I'll rewind to day one, if you like. I mean, I've said it too many times, it's becoming a cliche, but I did watch Crown Court on TV, which was a 1970s TV series, on ITV.
Who's old enough to remember Crown
Hands
Court?
up!
Yeah, hands up,
Thank you.
please. Hands up, please.
Yes, good, good. And interestingly, it was an ITV show. And of course, I was at ITV today, and we looked you up, and you said, yes, yeah. And it's absolutely true. I hated school. It was the 1970s, and there were very good reasons to hate school in the 1970s. Jimmy Savile wasn't one of them in my school, but there was, a lot of that. And there were violent places, absolutely awful. Child abuse was routine. So I didn't go to school as often as I should. And so I ended up being ill all the time and watching television. And the only thing on television in those days, there were 3 channels, and on ITV there was Crown Court mid-morning for a few days a week. It was one of these things that went several days, and you had actors playing the lawyers and an actor playing the judge, but you had real people as the jury. So you didn't know what was going to happen. You genuinely didn't know what was going to happen. That's so exciting. I wish they would do it now. And so I became really excited by this. And actually, criminal law in the Crown Court is like that. You don't know what's going to happen. And it's worse for the person being accused. But actually, for the lawyers, it's quite exciting because you know, the defendant turns up and gets tried. You don't know if they're walking out the front door or the back door in a van at the end. The life's either over or it's not. And that's hugely significant. And it gives you a sense of the power of words and the power of I mean, that's raw legal power. Civil is less dramatic. But honestly, Crown Court was quite realistic. It was a bit pompous, but I think courts were more pompous. So it was quite kind of accurate.
So how old are we here?
Yeah.
We're about 8 or 9 years of age. You're looking at Crown Court.
Yeah,
Okay.
that would be about right.
Right.
Yes, 70s. Yeah.
And was it like, oh, I want to do that?
I think I just liked it, and when I was asked at some parent party, what do you want to go up? I did actually say, you know, I can't be Queen, so I'll be a judge. Apparently, I actually said that. I don't. Actually, I can just about remember it. I mean, back in the day, in the 1970s, one would routinely give a sherry to a small child. So I probably had a sherry when I said it, but it got me started in the law. And I think I probably did say it, actually. Yeah.
Talk about the educational part of it then. So
Yeah.
how you decided to go about
Yeah.
getting into law. How did that come
Yeah.
about? So you did your A-levels and then...
Yeah, I mean, I was a computer geek in the 80s. Back then, you had to... you could write your own code. I mean, you could buy computer games, but equally you could break into them and work out how they worked and write your own. So that was quite fun. Now you buy a game and it's all high tech and it costs millions to make and it's moving. But actually, it was really fun writing your own that were just as good as the ones you might buy. So actually, I was really into computers, and so I became interested in brains because. Thinking about artificial intelligence and computers then was more about brains and how do brains think. So I actually became interested in how brains work, as well as how computers work. So I actually went on to read psychology at university. And in those days, if you wanted to do artificial intelligence, you actually did it in psychology. Because in those days, people were thinking more about how do brains think. That's our nearest model. So it was beginning to have engineering coming into it, but actually it was an experimental psychology subject. So I actually did that first, and then I did a doctorate in a branch of computational vision, but based on how the brain does the maths. And it was only after that I actually went in and did law. I did the conversion course in law after I did a doctorate in psychology, so law is kind of a parallel love. So I'm a scientist, really.
And I suppose the legal world is full of brains and brains
There
computing
they float
things.
around.
And,
yeah. I was about to say something about not enough of them in the Supreme Court, but I know that would be rude. But yes, so it's not psychology as in feelings and so on. It's psychology. My particular type of specialism was about how do brain cells work, how do they process information. In those days, concepts of what we call deep learning now they were popular back then, you know, because it comes around every 30 years. You know, it's the same maths. And how do brains do stuff? How do they process visual images? How do they combine three-dimensional information?
If you'd stayed in that field, what would the job look like? What would
I had to be an academic, really.
Right, okay.
And in those days, academic job, I think people in the room may differ because you actually do it, but my dad was an academic. He was an engineer. And his job was not very well paid. He had to work 2 jobs. He worked for the Open University and Oxford Polytechnic, as it was at the time, now Oxford Brookes University. He was one of the early academics in the Open University, but he had to work 2 jobs. And he actually had a stable couple of jobs, whereas actually academics did have to move around a lot. I mean, if you got a job at X university, it might be there for 3 years and you've got to move house and all the rest of it. And that just wasn't appealing to me. So law was better from that point of view.
Okay. Where did you do the conversion course? How long did that take?
City University, it was just the year, and then bar school after that. But the academic course was just the year.
And it was always, so the bar school, so you're talking about being a barrister. So
yes, I became a barrister.
That was the temptation, never the solicitor.
No.
Why?
Only child, centre of attention.
Confident?
Wind me up, start me talking.
Persuasive?
Making excuses to get out of trouble at school, persuasively, yes. Yeah, I was good at getting out of trouble. Manipulating my parents, that kind of, I had the skills. I never wanted to be a solicitor. I don't think I could be an employee very well. I always joke, when I was appointed as a judge, I always joke with the staff that I will get thrown out of school one day because I can't really work within an institution very well, any more than I could go to school often enough. I just have to do my own thing. And self-employed as a barrister actually is much better from that point of view, if that's the kind of person you are.
Yeah.
And so I did enjoy being a barrister. Clients used to say, you really enjoy your job, don't you? Yeah, I do, actually.
Yeah.
It's really good if you win, especially.
Yeah.
It doesn't matter, but...
You know, speaking from because I qualified as a solicitor back in Ireland, and I know from an Irish point of view, if you didn't have contacts in the law, you didn't even consider the barrister because you just wouldn't get you wouldn't get the government. You wouldn't. You got to know somebody to get in. Was any similarities to that in the UK, or is it slight?
I think Ireland has always been a bit more traditional. I have a friend in Belfast who's a solicitor. And they have a kind of almost fused, it's a sort of fused profession in a way, and he refers to his master. We would say we'd say now pupil supervisor as a barrister. Back in my day it was pupil master, but in his day, he's the same age as me, over there it was my master, which is a bit kind of, a bit weird. So quite formal and quite traditional. And there was definitely a thing, if you had the right surname, you did well, but equally, the people with the right surname also were really good. I mean, I won't name names, but you know, there's one person who's he or she is now a High Court judge, and he or she is the child of a very well-respected, now deceased member of the House of Lords judge. And to be honest, that person has done well because they're good as well. The name probably helped, but actually they were really good. They were in my
Did you have contacts though within the industry?
So you
went
dad
in.
Was working class.
He was academic. Yeah. So you got yourself a position within there, and then I presume just your career progressed.
I became a barrister. I came out as trans just after I qualified, about a year after or something. So I didn't really have a career at that point, but I technically had a career because I had qualified and I was self-employed in chambers, so they can't sack you. Because back then you'd be sacked if you were trans. Not in my chamber. I mean, they were lovely, but if I'd had a normal job, I'd been sacked anyway.
Yeah.
Just as shops would turn you away. I mean, you know, it was that kind of era. We had no legal rights. They came in just kind of around about that time, some limited employment rights. But the previous barrister before me, who I think was only a couple of years before, had been given a job in the Crown Prosecution Service, but never got to actually take up the job offer because they sacked her before she started when she came out and said, look, we can't have someone like you. It's not the right image for the Crown Prosecution Service. So I was lucky. I was that first generation where perhaps that was more possible.
Yeah. Talk a bit about
Yeah.
the cases that you've been involved in, so the highlights of the cases that you've been involved in, maybe pick two or three. But I mean, you have mentioned in the blurb that there's a defamation case around Donald Trump, I believe.
Well, I have to go to a conference in Chicago in September, and I want them to let me in. So, I mean, I found in Donald Trump's favour, so that should count. Okay, I haven't got a green card, but these days I'm not sure whether that's a good thing or not. But no, I found in favour of Donald Trump because he was being sued by a Muslim gentleman who had been the mayor of Tower Hamlets, I think. And Mr. President had said certain things about Muslim people during his election campaign.
Can I ask what timescale this is?
This is his first election,
Okay.
I think, or possibly his attempt to be re-elected when he lost. I can't quite remember. But he said certain things about lawlessness in the East End and no-go zones for police and Muslim people. And correctly, they were really offended. In some countries, if you have a defamation claim, and you're part of a group of people, like a religion or whatever, you can sue for a group defamation. You're part of an identifiable, you may be identified as an individual, but you're part of a group. In this country, you can't sue for group defamation, and this guy was suing effectively for group defamation on behalf of Muslims of the East End, kind of understandably. So I had to throw the case out, but not until we'd had a proper trial, because it was right that they should be heard and that their grievances were actually aired, because it would have been wrong to just throw it out by scribbling something on a piece of paper, which technically would be legally right, but where's the justice in that? And it makes the court look as if it doesn't care. And I did care, because these weren't nice things to say. and these were legitimate grievances. It's just the law offered no remedy for it.
Do you think there's many judges that would care about how the court comes across in a decision, or do you think there's ones who would just do the letter of the law and keep to it? Yeah, it's a hard question to answer, I appreciate, but you know,
increasingly,
you're kind of going past your remit there a little bit, aren't you? But in a nice way.
Increasingly, I think that might be some would, but disappointingly, I'm not sure. I don't want to sing my own praises, but I've only come to be a little more cynical that some people might not. And that's not, I don't like that. I don't like injustice. Mind you, the thing is, you grew up in the 70s, you saw injustice everywhere, so perhaps that's ingrained as well.
Yeah.
So
just back to that case, I'm slightly confused. So you held in favour of Trump, but
yes.
But you still wanted the grievances to be aired. I see your point.
Yeah,
right,
I gave them the day in court, and to the president's. Well, yeah, actually, you would call him Mr. President because he's already been president, I think. No, his lawyers went along with that. So that there might have been riots. I mean, that's the problem. If I just said, no, get lost, this is hopeless, you lose on paper.
So you're thinking wider picture there,
yeah,
really, community-based.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's important that I mean, there's justice being seen to be done, isn't there? And I'm not sure that justice would be seen to be done if I just scribbled something on a piece of paper. I don't think in that sort of situation where there is merit in what they're saying, but there just isn't legal merit, that it's right to just say no, hopeless.
Okay. And did you find in his favour on a technicality point? Or what
well, it's because you can't sue for group defamation.
I see. So it was absolutely... Oh, okay, interesting. So even though it got to court, even though they knew they just wanted to have some...
Well, they didn't. I think they didn't know. I had to explain. I mean, the point is it's important that they know why they lose.
So they've got some bad
and
legal
that
advice.
They're not... Well, they don't have any legal advice. They're representing themselves.
Okay.
But it's important they know why they've lost. And it's not that I agree with what he said.
I see.
It's that the law in this country is this.
I see.
But it's important, I'm not saying I agree. And it's all there in the judgment.
So where do costs fall in that kind of scenario?
To be honest, I don't think they asked for them. I think they had enough tact, which is interesting, because they probably got the dynamic in terms of why I was doing it, I suspect.
Okay, so it just was...
The lawyers, because
left.
it's these are British lawyers arguing a case, and I think they got the point.
Okay, interesting. Any other highlights of cases that you'd like to...
Well, I've handled cases with Johnny Depp and Jeremy Corbyn.
Well, let's start with Johnny Depp.
I'm trying to remember what it was. It was a defamation case. I can't remember.
No, that's all right. That's all right.
These names, they just come across you. Oh gosh, that famous, semi-famous, she rides horses and is Katie Price. That's it, Katie Price. I had.
Another defamation case?
I think it was probably, yes, and it was all over the papers. But they're not terribly legally interesting. They're just famous because of the celebs in
yes.
But from a lawyer's point of view, the most important case I think I did that mattered to me was it's a case called it's Dring against Cape Asbestos. And asbestos, as you probably know, is really dangerous stuff. There's no safe amount of exposure to asbestos, so it can kill you maybe 50 years later. And there'd been a court case about product safety. It sounds very dry, but obviously a lot of people have died over the years thanks to asbestos. And for the first time in history, instead of having a case where someone's died, and unfortunately in law a life isn't worth much, this was the insurance companies for companies that had to pay out on the deaths. So that there you've got actually a lot of money over many years that's been spent by insurance companies. So for the first time ever, these insurance companies decided, well, we're going to say asbestos always was a dangerous product and that you probably knew more than you let on, so we are actually now going to sue you properly. And because there was so much money involved, for the first time ever, it meant that all the documents showing the history of who knew what when with asbestos were gathered from around the world, because Cape was this enormous company around the world, and asbestos is a product you mine in mines, so it was all over the world. For the first time ever, all the archives and everything had been put together in one place. Now that would never happen if it was one person who died, because the money isn't there to do that. It was in this case. So a trial took place over several weeks, and the judge, and it wasn't me trying it, the judge went away to consider the judgment, and the documents were there in their thousands and thousands, electronically and actually physically too. But while the judge was considering his judgment, the parties settled out of court. And you can do that until the judgment's given, you can settle out of court. And one of the terms of the settlement, as was discovered, was that the documents would be got rid of.
Wow.
And money would be paid. I can't remember the exact terms, but it was along the lines of either they get returned to Cape and then get disseminated around the world because there'll never be a case big enough to put them together again, or destroyed. But that information leaked out because a barrister who had been for the asbestos company put up some slides during a Chambers lecture which had some material from within the documents that had some statistics in them. And people in the audience spotted that these were quite significant from within the disclosure in the case. At that point, people interested in the history of asbestos safety came forward and said, oh, as members of the public, we want access to these documents because these documents were part of the court file. And open justice means we need to see these documents because they're important documents. And there then ensued a sort of battle where both sides were trying to get hold of the documents to get rid of them from the previous judge. I made an order saying, no, they're not allowed to leave the courtroom because there was an emergency application to me to preserve them before they were got rid of. And then I had a couple of hearings where I decided that there was a common law right, in principle, if the court lets you, to see anything in a court case. So the court rules said you can have quite a limited range of documents. And I said that actually there is a common law principle that goes beyond that, so that the court could, if it's appropriate, actually let you see anything. And so I ordered that all the documents be handed over to an academic, you see, who was a member of the public, had applied from a charity. But what they wanted was that the University of Strathclyde wanted to create an archive of sort of the industrial history of asbestos. Okay. And of course it'd be very important to victims around the world. Around the world, so you're talking about America too, where the damages are much higher. So I made that order, and I did give them the documents. That went to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal were, the judges were all alive, so I'll simply say that they weren't collegiate about their views and found against me. But then the Supreme Court upheld the principle of a common law right of access, which is the one that I'd found there was. And that stands today as the leading case on open justice, or at least obviously the Supreme Court one does. Wow. But I did the first instance one, and they agreed with me. So I got justice. So that's the one I think I'm most proud of, because there's a history there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's now an archive.
And a legacy.
That's an archive.
Proper legacy.
Yeah, and that would have gone. So that I think matters a lot to me. As a barrister, I did the case that legalised no win, no fee in non-personal injury cases. It used to be illegal to have no win, no fee ambulance chasey sort of cases. And I did a very small case just out of pupillage, which turned out ending up in the Court of Appeal with me doing it, where they actually upheld the idea that you can do no win, no fee now. It's not illegal anymore.
Okay, brilliant. Brilliant. Listen, we're going to pause there because I don't want to do a traditional big long chat with you and then a Q&A at the end. So we're going to pause there and we'll have a Q&A just on Victoria's career, what we've talked about so far. That's okay. And then we're going to, just to flag up, we're going to get into AI after that. And then we're going to get into the recent Supreme Court decision after that. For those who are online, a reminder to email radio@bill.ac.uk any comments or questions, and we will answer them. We don't have the capacity to deal with your questions online, I'm afraid, in the live sphere, but we certainly will pick them up. radio@bill.ac.uk. For people in the crowd with me here, you need to speak into this when you ask your question. I will run around and hand it to you, okay? So in relation to Victoria's career so far, any questions, please, from... Yeah. Go for it, mate.
We thank you so very much for being here with us. My name is Ruben. I'm a second-year law student, and I'm also the Law Society leader. My question is, what would you say was your best and worst experience as a female
in law?
Judge.
Trying to think whether it's as a female or just as a judge, really. First case I ever did as a judge, it was about the barrister's fees, and the barrister whose fees it was came along to argue his case. and I decided something. It was just about the numbers. It's all very dry, but he basically said, "You cannot be." He did John McEnroe. You cannot be serious. And this is like my first case. And I could feel my face going really blushing. And the more you think about it, the worse you get. Everyone's looking at me now, and it's my first case. That was quite bad. So I got over that pretty quickly. Yeah, I don't think I've had very bad, as a judge, not very bad experiences, I've got to say. Yeah, I mean, people are just very nice. They all have to be polite. They have to laugh at my jokes. I mean, I've been threatened by people. I've had death threats. I've had all that sort of stuff. But I can't say that's bad. I mean, I always say I've got a very hard stare, sort of thing. So
Pretty bad.
I don't think I've had really. Well, yeah, some people would say it's bad. Yeah. There's a guy who's been sent to prison for wanting to kill me, but he didn't.
Yeah.
He's got opportunity yet, you know. But yeah, it just doesn't feel bad. I just enjoyed the job so much that probably anything would be all right. Best experiences is where you do the job really well as well. So that you've done, you haven't messed it up, but also you've actually done it slightly better than you might have done it before, and you can leave work thinking, yeah, I did that quite well, really. Especially if somebody's lost the case and says thank you afterwards, because now they understand why they lost. And that's a real bonus. That's only happened about 3 times, but it does happen. I've actually had people say, actually, no, I understand. And that's amazing when that happens. Yeah.
Yes, Ruben, if I can have the mic. Thank you so much. Arif?
Thank you. It's Arif, one of the business lecturers here. Bit of a confession time. I've been watching the trial of Christine Keeler recently, and just on Netflix, and I was very struck by that, the BBC, a few years ago. But what I was very struck about, coming to the question, was how attitudes within the legal profession have changed. You know, if you look at the way that the legal professionals are portrayed in that drama, it's pretty poor, really, relatively speaking. So my question is, growing up in the 70s, going into, thinking about going to the legal profession, was it, obviously you made that decision to go into it, but it must have been pretty off-putting at times in terms of some of the culture, the atmosphere, and to what extent did you navigate that?
I mean, I was obviously, although I grew up, I regard myself, but I wouldn't, I was more of an 80s child, even though I grew up in the 70s as well. So things were changing. I mean, I think about my pupil supervisor, Christine. She qualified as a barrister in 1976. There would have been a handful of female barristers. And you were told you've got to do family law, and it was really awful. And how these people are not just really angry and bitter, I do not know. And when I qualified, looking back on it, it was probably pretty antiquated then as well. And that's in the 90s, actually. But you sort of don't realise so much at the time, especially, and this would be pre-transition as well, so I wasn't directly on the receipt. You see it, but you don't quite internalise it in the same way, I suspect. And the world was pretty sexist in the 80s, still. I don't know if it's... Yes, I'm sure it's changed, but not entirely. I mean, you hear things said that... I do a lot of work with a lot of my friends are Asian judges, and they've had a pretty bad time as judges. Better time as barristers, and then they become judges, and it's not necessarily good. I'm allowed to talk about these things now because I'm no longer a judge. And, but people I know would say there's a lot of racism.
Okay. Any other questions about... Joan.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
Thank you. There's a lack of diversity in the profession, especially as one moves upwards into the higher echelons and so on. And it's something our students are really, really aware of.
Is this in the judiciary more than in particular, or in the legal profession as well?
Yeah,
it's true
in the legal profession and in the judiciary as well. And you're obviously somebody who's negotiated a lot of obstacles. What would be your top tip to our students in terms of just staying the course, persevering, and being able to move on to where they want to be?
I think... I know it's kind of weird, but if you help other people, then they're going to help you later. I always say to people, you might be a year ahead of someone, but if you help someone junior to you, next time they'll help you back. There's room for everybody. And I think a lot of the problem with things like discrimination and so on is this sense that it's a zero-sum game, that there isn't enough room for everybody. Yes, there is. It's not that huge a profession. It's not actually competitive in that sense. You do not have to slaughter people to get on. And there are some people that will pull the ladder up after them. They won't be well remembered. They won't get as much out of their careers. And actually, if you help people, then people remember that you've helped them in the robing room when they didn't have a book or something. So it's about people skills, actually. It's about getting on with people and actually not... It's weird, but it's not competing in a sort of way. And that there's a feminist point there, because obviously the system has been structured around the greasy pole and the sword fight and the we win and we lose and then we have a joke in the bar about it. But actually a more collaborative approach is a slightly more feminist approach. And actually that's the way that you also get diversity. You have that collaborative approach which actually helps everyone up. And that works, that does work. We don't get enough of it in the judiciary. We actually have a system. Some people would call it secret soundings, others would call it statutory consultation. But basically, if you are let's say you're an Asian solicitor, you've got a good chance of being appointed as a junior district judge, in your local court. You're a local solicitor, no reason why you shouldn't do that work, jolly good. But once you're there, if you want a promotion, then there's a process where questionnaires go out to your colleagues, your senior colleague, which won't be very senior because you'll be in a small court out somewhere, They ask questions about you, but you don't know what they're saying, and you're never told what they say, and you're not necessarily aware the questions are being asked. So people's careers are effectively blocked that way, and particularly if you're talking about local courts, less in London, but if you're talking about local courts where certain sets of chambers control things, certain families are important locally in the bar, whatever. Actually, if you're seen as an outsider, brackets, you're a woman who goes home to her family, or brackets, you're a Muslim and you don't drink, well, you're less sociable. It doesn't mean to say they're going to write bad things, although they do, but you can damn with faint praise, because if the person who goes down the pub with you is better known, then they're jolly clubbable, aren't they? Aren't they nice? So you get that structural inequality through process. And that's really should change. And obviously I know a lot of, I'm afraid it's especially Asian judges. I think largely because we virtually don't have any black judges. I'm sure it would be just the same. It's just that there are more Asian judges. So there are more people to complain about it, and there are more people to draw it to my attention. And many of my good friends, we know the detail. So it is a structural inequality, and it really does need to go. I couldn't have said that while I was still a judge.
Yeah. Okay, lovely. So we're going to move on to, I'm conscious of time. Gosh, Victoria's a talker, as you can see, making my job nice and easy.
My mother is up there going, she's a talker.
But what I'm conscious of is trying to get through the next two topics. So, because we've had some of our students who are here this evening, who hung around this evening actually, had an AI sort of brainstorming session today, if that's right. I'm sure I'm probably mistitling it, but something along those lines. And I know you're a bit of an expert.
Sort of my background.
Bit of an expert in that with the psychology and the AI. So I guess, I'm from a real kind of, Joe Blogg's point of view, but from my standpoint. Tell us about kind of the risks of AI and law, but the good stuff about AI and law, if you like, if you could talk about those.
Well, I'll start with Elton John.
Okay, start with Elton. He was on the news last night about it, wasn't he?
Richard Madeley actually asked me about him, but not on camera. But this at this point that, AI... you train these AI systems, and the reason you give them data, they learn stuff. And you give them lots of data, and you tell them what the right answer is, and they learn. And the way they work is statistical. And this is kind of like how brains work, because this goes right back to the type of research I actually did do. This is deep learning. So these systems learn complex interactions between things, and that means you can't actually erase something. These things are not being remembered in the usual sense, so you can just delete it. So once you've learned Elton John's music, that's disappeared into the system. It's like a ripple in a pond. You can't get the ripple back because it's interacted with all the other ripples. It's gone, but it's influenced everything. And that's just like how we learn. Our influences in life teach us how we ultimately perform music or whatever we might do, and we may not know how we're being influenced, and we can't really unlearn our influences. Well, deep learning is like that. The problem is you're talking about copyright. You're talking about money being made out of having used people's production in AI. So a massive problem in AI is, what do you do if you can't unlearn? And there isn't a mathematical way of unlearning at the moment. moment. I don't necessarily think it's even in principle solvable. That's a big issue. And of course, the controversy at the moment is our government saying, well, we would just quite like to make this fine. You can't sue if your work's been used. And Elton John's obviously been up in arms, and lots of artists are up in arms about the fact that for the sake of the country's commercial interests and trade...
Can that be controlled? It sounds like it's...
well, you can... I mean, it's a little bit stable door because a lot of these AIs have already been trained. It might help for the future. But equally, I suppose you could have compensation in the sense that if you have used other people's work to train AI, there might at least be compensation, like a license fee. And then maybe laws in future about you mustn't do it without a license. But of course, there's the problem that a lot of these are American companies. We have our system here. It may be in the national interest to trade with the US and to have laws which let this happen, but no wonder the artists are unhappy about that. So I think one of the big issues is that copyright thing. The other issue is ecological, because AI consumes huge resources. It burns water. It uses huge amounts of electricity. If you had to erase stuff, the only way you can actually erase is to get rid of it all and start again and retrain the whole thing and omit the stuff that you shouldn't have done. And if you have to do that, you are going to lose all the rainforests. You're going to completely destroy the environment. And in fact, there's a huge risk, I'm afraid, that we will destroy our environment the more AI we use. Because for each 10 questions you ask ChatGPT, you are burning litres of water and you're releasing heat into the atmosphere. There's a quantifiable ecological cost per question on ChatGPT. And this is going all over the world. And the more powerful the AI gets, the more it burns.
This might sound like a silly question, but what about barristers and judges being replaced by AI? Is that something that could...
well, I mean, I think AI could be really useful for creative thinking and being... I've always called it like having a co-pilot. So you could have a system that knows more about law than you do, because a human can't know all about this, and a system that might work out some things and help you by pointing out some things that sits on your shoulder, like Jiminy Cricket in Pinocchio. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. It's a sort of second opinion. You can do that in medicine. I mean, I think it's a great thing in medicine that you know, if you're an oncologist, you can't expect the latest to know every bit of the latest research. But something that might occasionally, it's like an autopilot in a plane, you know, it might save you. I don't think there's a problem with that. The analogy I use when you talk about robo-judges, someone said, well, would you trust AI to bring up your children? And my answer to that is, well, I'd want to know the AI's parents better. Because that's the point. It's not that you have a machine that's a parent, but you need to know where it's come from, what its background is. You have to think about it in those terms, because we are not one-off machines. We are the product of our social environment, our interactions. You know, I don't exist on my own in this room. My consciousness is being shared with all of you because I'm using these words. You're having your thoughts. You may talk to me later. So my thinking is going to be influenced by your thinking. We're one set of brains in this room. I'm not an isolated brain. As a society, we are networked brains. We don't exist in isolation, whereas people think of AI as existing in isolation.
Human connection.
So we are bigger than that. We're not even brains on our own. We have our bodies, we have our nerves. You know, there's no such thing as a brain. My brain extends to my fingertips. Even my organs have little local brains. They have ganglia that think for themselves and get on with their jobs. They're specialised little liver jobs. They don't even tell my brain what they're doing. They just produce the result and run on their own. So we are internally, we're effectively a society among our own organs. Bits of our brains are talking to each other. So the smell-o-vision bit talks to the other bit. And they talk a different language, but somehow they get on. But yet then we talk outside of ourselves and share our consciousness and our thinking with others. You then think, or you may not think about what I'm saying, but if you do think about what I'm saying, you are reprocessing it and having your own thoughts influenced by your own experience. So you take what I'm saying and you might take it further or take it in a different direction and reflect it back at me. So you're adding capacity to my brain by thinking about what I'm saying and then reflecting it back to me. So together, literally, together we're stronger. Well, we are. This is what humans do. We're one great big intelligence. We're not individual intelligences. And I think if we think about computers as little programs on their own, well, they're never going to be human-level intelligence because humans are not individuals.
Now, I'm going to go straight to questions about AI because I'm sure there's people that want to talk about that? Some of the students perhaps who went through their session this afternoon want to share something? I'm going to go straight to Joe. Please get thinking about your questions around AI.
Thank you. It's one of the issues, though, if we take the judiciary and the fear of AI, by saying, well, we've got a machine making a decision, is that when we talk about humans, we forget that humans also have their own prejudices and bias.
Yeah, and they follow rules too, so they're kind of being a machine.
And in fact, where they've looked at AI decision making in some of the areas where they've in law, they've found that it's been in some ways more accurate in decisions.
Some areas of medicine as well, they can be better.
And in medicine, bail, decisions on different sentencing. Yeah. So, do you think that there will be more decision making at the sharp end?
I mean, my hypothesis is that actually I think it probably would be possible, particularly in areas which are quite rules-based. I mean, if you think about family law, now I don't mean children law, I mean family, divorce, money type law. Actually, in family, in the past I did a certain amount of family law. There's only so many scenarios in divorces. You'd think they're all different, but actually there's only so many really. People have a house, maybe the husband and wife, or two husbands or two wives, run a business together. So you get a number of permutations and the house is worth this much or whatever. But actually, ultimately, I think if you had a specialist system where you get all the data from all the cases, now I don't mean the judgment, I mean the court file, the actual detail, and train a general AI, you could probably have a system that gets better and better at predicting the outcome of a case to within a statistical margin. So in other words, it could say to parties, before the case even starts, I have looked at 3 million cases. In cases of this type, by which I mean blur, the usual outcome is in this sort of range with a 90% chance. And that's based on past cases. Obviously, different judges vary, and it's kind of averaging that out. But the people are not getting human advice there, they're getting advice that's purely based on actual statistics and outcomes. It's not the other side being clever, it's not your lawyer being rubbish, it's literally just what judges do. So if you say to them at the start, this is the typical outcome, and where a case goes to court, the typical cost is this, they can then be advised by someone who may not be a lawyer. You could go to Citizens Advice and ask the computer. Equally, the lawyers could use that. But equally, if you could train a system, so that let's say you gather data over time. So from the start of a case, the system starts learning, and then it monitors that throughout. So you know the outcome, and you know the enforcement, and you know what happened. And then you compare that to your prediction at the start, and then you gradually refine your prediction. I think you could end up with a system where you have these niche specialist areas which are relatively constrained, where that becomes useful. And if you could ever get that to be, and that's scientifically testable, because you can actually test your prediction against the eventual outcome. And if you can get that reliable, you can then have court rules that say, do you want to bet against the banker? Because if the computer says this is the probable outcome and you don't like it, fine. But if you don't beat what the banker has said, you pay the costs. You can only do that when you've verified, when you've got the actual, if you like, scientific proof that this is reliable. But the point is that's a tractable problem in science. You can test that because you are literally watching real cases, predicting, and then comparing your prediction with the outcome and learning from your failures and so on. So it becomes no longer that some humans have invented some rules and they think it's clever, that it's actually demonstrably accurate then. Either that or it's impossible, but we don't know unless we try it. And my hypothesis is that in some areas it would be possible.
I'm sorry, can I just ask a supplementary to that? Because one of the problems of law is it's about enforcing your rights and costs.
Yes.
So do you think that
you have to follow the thing from cradle to grave. And the model, I mean, I've talked about this in various conferences. Yeah, I call it cradle to grave. You don't stop at the end of the case. You don't just process the judgment. You actually process, this is where it gets controversial. You have mandatory negotiation. You actually process the negotiations. So you have to encrypt it and so on, but you need access to the negotiations because you need to know the cases that settle without going to court, and you need to know what factors influence the settlement. Because it's actually the whole thing So if the dispute officially starts before the court proceedings, but you have to go through a mandatory structured form of dispute resolution, you're then following it right through. Then you've got the aftermath, the actual enforcement, then the costs. Was there an appeal from the cost? What was the actual net outcome? How long did it take? Because that's another cost. And sometimes people will prefer to get it done quicker for less money. But the computer can say that if it knows that and it's followed it from start to finish. So it has to be rich data, but the whole thing from start to finish. And enforcement's a major issue. In family law in particular, it's huge. I mean, you can settle a family divorce case, but you don't get your money for years because the system's a bit broken, frankly. It's a really important factor.
Okay. Yes. Next to go for it.
Thank you so much. I guess I don't necessarily have a very direct question, but would like more to know your thoughts on the matter. When it comes to AI, I've heard a lot of people discussing that AI is not necessarily the cause of the problem, but it's more the outcome of the problem. And the cause of the problem being the increasingly rapid consumption and overconsumption and necessity of how fast human life moves now. Mm-hmm. I've seen a lot of people using AI, for example, to generate CVs. And that's because, like, years ago, decades ago, people only had to apply to a handful of jobs until they received a job offer. Yeah. Now it's quite common for people to apply to 100, 200 job applications until they get that offer. So, and that is together with a lot of other requirements. So I'm wondering if there's a way to use AI or a way of just raising societal awareness, changing culture around us in which AI can be used to maybe like slow down the
well, I mean, it's almost like an arms race, isn't it? I mean, you know, if you've got 100 candidates, then the one with the faster computer and the better AI may produce the better CVs. And then it becomes a battle of, you know, how good is the candidate plus the computer? They're a joint candidate. Maybe they should both be paid.
And it becomes the personal assistant that it's marketed as, but before people had the money to maybe have a personal assistant.
And I mean, the same could be true in court cases where you have rival proprietary AI systems that outwit each other, for example, or that predict the other side's moves. So you're getting an arms race, which suddenly is a new kind of law, because it's not really law, it's actually then tactics and strategy. And AI is not actually that creative. It tends to produce very bland things. So at the moment, I'm not sure that's so much of a threat. But equally, you know, where you've got that sort of statistical basis, you can have systems trying to outwit other systems. And we do kind of disappear down the plug hole in the bath. I mean, it could become... Well, it may end up with no net outcome, because everyone reaches stalemate, and we're no better off than we were in the first place. I think that can be a problem, but I think a bigger problem with AI is people just using it to take shortcuts. So there isn't the human creative thought. And the AI isn't particularly creative, so no one's being creative. So you only need one creative thinker, and they're going to win, aren't they? So it's a bit of weakness. You know, so that's not good. But I think people may be a little reliant on just taking the easy option. Really.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ruben. I'm going to come back to you because I'm conscious of time. It's almost 6:20. So, just in relation to AI being good guys, bad guys, I think it's interesting that the new Mission Impossible movie has certainly put AI as
I haven't
number one.
seen that yet. Don't
number
spoil
one.
the plot.
Well, AI is the bad guy. And very clever by all accounts. Yeah, I know, I'm excited as well. So I want to move into the conversation then about the recent Supreme Court decision and to talk about how the landscape has completely changed for you. And if you were willing to chat about that.
Yes. Yeah.
And just tell us what's going on with that from your personal point of view, where you're bringing legal proceedings against that decision that the Supreme Court made. We wish to expand on that.
Yeah, I mean, how much do people know? What's the kind of...
Yeah, well, I think probably a lot, but I'd go from the top. So what did the Supreme Court decide?
There's this Act of Parliament called the Gender Recognition Act that was passed a couple of decades ago, And there are about 8,000 people who ever used it, and I was one of them because I've been around a long time. And there's a legal process you go through whereby a court can enable you to re-register your birth. So I was born and registered male, and then I went through this process back in 2006, which is just as soon as the Act came into force. So my birth certificate says I'm female, and my birth registration says I'm female because I've been through a legal process. And what the statute says is that I am, my sex is that of a woman for all purposes. It literally just says that. But then you've got the Equality Act, which came along a little later. Now, when the 2004 statute came in, discrimination was regulated, among other things, by the Sex Discrimination Act 1975, which was one of the original kind of sex discrimination statutes. And it was quite clear that that was affected by the 2004 Act. In other words, if I was paid less than a man at work, then I am a woman for sex discrimination, so I should be paid the same. That's kind of easy. Unfortunately, what the Supreme Court has found is that that isn't the case under the current legislation, so I don't count as female. Despite one statute saying for all purposes I am, I'm not. So I'm two sexes at once. So for all discrimination law, I'm a man. So if I'm paid less than a man, I can't sue for equal pay because I'm not a woman. Mm. So I've lost the rights to equal pay. But it also goes into issues such as the right of people to act biologically. In other words, if you have a little stick figure of a woman on a door, what does that mean? If it means biosex, if it means whatever biological sex is, which isn't defined, the court used that expression, but if it means biosex, then the government has said, after the Supreme Court decision, the Supreme Court didn't say this, but the government has said I should not be going in there and that I should only be going to the men's loos or changing rooms or whatever it may be, because these are now officially biological. So a building owner or whatever would need to put up a little sign probably saying, not bio-designated, you know. It's a picture of a woman, but we don't mean that sort of thing. Yeah. Unfortunately, institutions are taking the easy option and are simply saying, yep, that's what it means, bio. Mm-hmm. So if I go to the pub, the official government line would be I've got to use the men's loos. Yeah. Which it'd be embarrassing if I tried, because I have female anatomy. It's also not safe. Yeah. I mean, it's safe depends where you go, because men are not bastards, but equally, it can be dangerous. If I was at a pub in the East End, that's a very different thing from going to Soho or something, a delightful gay bar or whatever. Yeah. It's also demeaning. It's embarrassing for the men, for a start, if I walk in and take notes. I used to tease my colleagues about this because I foresaw this while I was still a judge, and I said, you realise I'll take notes if I go there. They would have been so much more comfortable than I would. So officially the situation in this country, according to the government, is impossible for people like me.
So your appeal...
Yes.
You obviously had some time to process the judgment, you read through the judgment, whatever, and then you came to a decision where, right, I'm going to appeal this. So on what basis, I presume you can't talk about it, can you talk about the details?
Well, there's certain things that I don't want to reveal strategically.
No, of course, no, I get that,
But there are certain cunning plans.
No strategy being revealed here.
But the obvious one is that there were no trans people involved in the case at all. Okay, from start to finish.
But is that a point? Is that?
Yeah, that's an Article 6 point. That's a right to, well, it's also common law, frankly, but that's a human rights point in itself.
Right.
So myself and one trans man, because remember this is only 8,000 people. Okay, it's actually technically a very small subset of trans people, although the judgment has a much wider impact. The case was actually only about 8,000 of us. And we don't know who each other is. I mean, we're not like a society who know each other. So you can't have a representative body for us. We wouldn't know who we are. But myself and Professor Whittle from Manchester that I've known for many years, we date back from to the days of the 2004 Act. We applied to be heard by the Supreme Court so that we could put forward the impact on us of certain different constructions of the meanings of the statute. Yep. And the Supreme Court wouldn't allow us in and didn't give reasons for refusing us. But they did allow in a range of groups who had a particular position all in the same direction as to excluding us from spaces and biological sex and all this thing. So the net result was that there was no perspective from the impact on real trans people.
Yes.
The only trans people that were present in the room were the idea of a trans person.
Yes.
And we've been very badly misrepresented in the press, and most people from the 8,000 are invisible. These are people who probably transitioned, they came out maybe 30 years ago. They're in jobs where nobody at work knows they're trans. Now they're going to be outed because suddenly Belinda has got to go and use Bob's loo. I mean, you know, all of a sudden, and they're terrified because they've never been outed at work. They've just gone on with their lives and nobody knows. And of course, we were not present, because everyone knows I'm trans, because I was in the public eye and I came out during my career, but other people have just come along and just got on with it. And the difficulty that those people are facing is that makes life humiliating for a start. But it also interferes with your professional career. I mean, if you've got clients, it's going to look pretty weird if you peel off and go to the men's loos. I mean, that in itself is weird. And that impacts families too, because, you know, if you think about the archetypal, I'm going to do a stereotype here, but mummy and daddy and 2 kids. Mummy was born female and they're 2 kids. Daddy happens to be a trans man. This is absolutely, I know, this happens, this is a real situation. They're just a straight couple, okay? They've been married for a long time. They've got kids. Now they're a lesbian couple because the Supreme Court said, they didn't stop at sex, they said, to be lesbian, you must be a biological woman attracted only to biological women, as if you have a nose for it, as if you could sniff this out. Most lesbians I know are horrified by the idea, but there is a particular perspective which is very niche, but unfortunately the Supreme Court took that. So a straight couple that have been straight for 20 years, well, if they're still kids, they wouldn't be 20 years, but anyway, they're now a lesbian couple.
Yeah.
Nobody asked the woman in that relationship. She's never fancied women. You know, she fell in love with her bearded, tattooed, rugby-playing husband, who happens to be a trans man. But no, she is now forced to be labelled as a lesbian.
Okay.
And all the other permutations in the same way.
Okay.
But one of the biggest impacts is that the Supreme Court said that there's also an appearance test. So if I, as I'm supposed to apparently, if I use the men's loos, but I look too female, whatever that means, I can be excluded from the men's loos. So I've got to cross my legs, basically. And the same is true for trans men. If trans men go into the ladies, as they're now supposed to, but they look too male, they can be banned from that as well, because that might upset people. So there's nowhere for them to pee. I mean, you've got to bring your chamber pot with you.
Yeah.
So we can't win. I mean, it's obviously a mad situation. It's very, very difficult.
Sure, and if the appeal is going to the European...
Yes, so it was that's Article 6. We weren't heard, so our perspective wasn't heard. There's also Article 8, which, because the decision has effectively reversed the position as it was in 2002, after the UK had lost human rights cases. So we've literally just abandoned the previous human rights law. So we're back in breach again. So the reason we had the Act in the first place is that the UK was in breach of human rights. So here we go again. So yes, it'll go to Strasbourg. It's not an appeal, it's an application. The most we can get out of it is a declaration that the UK is in breach.
Okay, and then it goes where?
Well, then it stops. I mean, what trans people found before was we won lots of cases back in the 90s. But once you've done that, nothing happens unless you then get a government that's prepared to actually solve that problem.
I see.
So you can't order the UK government to do something. If you're Strasbourg, you can only say, yes, you're in breach. And then they sort of trust the decency of it.
Yeah.
The problem is that's then politics.
Yeah.
So as trans people found before, we had decades of bringing cases. It was only when we got the Tony Blair government in 1997 onwards where we first had a government that would actually do something about it. So now we're back to that. Now, it can take 6 years to get a hearing at the Strasbourg court. That's just the hearing.
Yeah.
Then if you win, how many years is it going to be before a government's prepared to do anything, even if you do win?
Yeah.
So we could be looking at 10 years plus. I will be 65, which I like to think isn't as old as it sounds to these young people in the room.
That's young.
But and I've left the country anyway, so I'm not likely really to benefit from this if we do, and I'm probably not coming back, frankly. I'll have settled in Ireland, I'll have my EU passport back. But unfortunately for younger people, unlike, you know, most things in modern life where you can order something from Amazon and it comes the next day, we were in for a long wait if we're going to do it through the courts.
Yeah.
Politics, however, can do things much quicker.
Yeah.
And what needs to happen, of course, is political change. And that, as I said on the television live today, means, I'm sorry to say, that those responsible for the present situation, namely Mr Starmer, Bridget Phillipson and Wes Streeting, they've got to go, because the fact is that policy needs to change. If it doesn't change, then we are on for at least a decade of these ongoing problems. The Labour government hasn't washed its hands of it. I know it would like to, but we're not going to stop. So this is going to be a continuing problem about lose and all the rest of it. They're not going to escape this, so they really need to fix it politically, and that's the fast way to do it.
Okay. Conscious of time, questions in relation to this particular subject? Anybody got any questions? Yeah.
Thank you so much. Hi, how are you? It was a pleasure listening to you, of course. And as a law student, I would like to ask you, I moved here from Pakistan last year, and as I'm seeing people who are graduating, my friend who just recently cleared her bar as well.
Yeah.
So what would your advice be to young lawyers, future lawyers? Because I've seen a lot of internships and everything going around, and I think I'm starting my second year soon.
Yeah.
So shadowing someone isn't really an opportunity. That's for me right now. So what do you think, if you want to go towards practicality when it comes to the field of law, what would your advice be to
what
the
sort
young?
of law? Is it bar or solicitor?
Bar.
Bar.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is really important to try and find, you know, visiting chambers and that sort of thing. And I don't know, try and write articles and that sort of stuff too, I think, and get your image. Always think about selling, because actually being a barrister is about selling, and you need to sound like a bigger product than you are at the start. Yeah. So if you get a case, I mean, what I used to do, if I got little tiny cases, okay, and we didn't, there's stuff on the internet, but actually current law was a paper book, you know, and you could send in little reports of cases if they were slightly interesting, such as personal injury, how much did someone get for a broken leg. And actually, if I had found one that was just slightly unusual, I had a case about cheeses on one occasion, okay, and I think the company was Titanic Cheeses, which is great. And I was against Titanic cheeses, and I sent a note to my solicitor saying they went down without trays. But of course, because it's just slightly unusual, there's a little point of procedure or something. You write that up and you send it. It's not really a reported case, but it looks good on your CV because you've got stuff that's out there. And it's something then to talk about. And if you're barrister, you've got to talk about yourself. Because really important, okay? And you're never in any way failing. You are always a success. Never portray yourself as too much of a success because people will see that. But actually, never be humble. Never be humble. And take opportunities and run with them. If you get a case and it doesn't seem like much, it might have a point of law in it. And go for it if you find it.
Staying on the topic, though, of the Supreme Court decision, I'm going to go to Mehdi and then I'll come back to Joan, if that's okay.
Hello, thank you so much. I just wanted to ask, does the rule include anything covering intersex individuals or people?
Well, that's another group that were completely left out. I mean, I don't think they asked. They found themselves, they've literally just found themselves even worse off than they were before, because they're not even recognised, but now they're sort of double unrecognised. No, they're just even worse. So nobody asked them. And nobody asked the children with the straight family that I was talking about. Nobody asked the kid of the family what about their rights? They're suddenly in a gay family or vice versa. Nobody asked them. Nobody represented children's rights either. Intersex people, disabled people. Because we're now being told, just use the disabled loos. And well, no, I don't want to do that. Disabled loos are there for disabled people, and they have different facilities, and there are medical needs, and why should they have to queue outside while a bunch of trans people have to wee because politicians tell us to? Nobody talked about their rights either. It's a complete mess. And there were a lot of groups that weren't heard, and there wasn't a big enough overview of the sheer importance of this for our society. It was seen as a narrow question of the meaning of a statute, devoid of the fact that the meaning of a statute can determine your substantive rights. It's not just words. Words have power in law. And these words have huge power and massive implications that have affected groups way beyond trans. They're going to affect every woman who doesn't look feminine enough, because women now are being asked to leave the loos because they're suspected of being trans. And it's not the trans people who get hit by that. It's just everyday women, because they don't think about whether they should look female necessarily, but they are actually being told to leave. It's not just lesbian people, it's actually a lot of women. And you know, that's going to get worse. So it's actually a big societal problem. And in some ways, the trans people, we're so small, you know, we're also victims, but actually society as a whole is the victim here.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You just throw it over. So I'm going to go to Lexa quickly.
Thank you.
Keep your questions brief.
I can't keep the answers brief, that's my problem.
Just following on Victoria's answer right now, apart from the impact that it is on trans people, I really wonder if most of the population is holding on for a second to realize that this is a gateway for regulating people everywhere. It is starting, as you said, with trans people, and it is continuing to the gender binary of how a real man should look, how a real woman should look, going into relationships and all levels. We've seen recently the overturn of Roe v. Wade in the States and the devastating impact that had. Do you have any other legal examples of cases that people can look at and really learn from history, fingers crossed, so they can kind of like open their eyes to how this is going to start impacting everyone, from non-binary people to the straightest of the men?
Yeah, I mean, yes, brief. I mean, unfortunately, I've got to refer, to World War II. I mean, the demonisation of a minority by systematically removing them from positions of responsibility and then using law to put them in a special category and then forming a register of them. Because, of course, the current state of the data privacy bill, or whatever it's called, is that they will create a register of people like me. Now, when you start doing like that with a minority, we know that never ends well. And we need to learn from that history. And trans people were in the concentration camps too. We did die there with our Jewish brothers and sisters. And the political prisoners. There are a lot of other categories that were picked on and systematically erased. We have been there before and we need to learn from it, but our minority is so small and so voiceless that people aren't really hearing.
Rico.
Hi, nice to meet you. My name's Rico. I'm sorry to hear about what you've been through since the ruling, but for women though, I've got younger sisters, right, who haven't got fathers in their lives, so I'm the next male role model for them. And I can't count how many situations I've been in because men have decided to follow them into the bathrooms. Yeah. And I've had to literally put myself in a compromisable position.
And they're not even trans people.
No, they were trans people.
Oh, men?
Yeah. So like,
how interesting, I've never seen that.
So yeah. Don't you feel like it was a bit of a smart ruling in terms of safety for women who have been in like dangerous situations for people who use that opportunity to pounce on you?
Yeah, I mean, it's nice to hear from you because you're the first person that's ever told me that you've got first-hand witness of that, because I've never heard of it before. Yeah, if men do that, then they're breaking the law, but they're not going to be trans people. I mean, why would they be? There are criminals out there, and I don't see why they need to dress up as women to do that. I mean, men attack women every day of the week, sadly. They don't have to wear a dress to do it. And we still have male cleaners in female loos, so it doesn't seem to me to be necessary for people to dress up in fancy dress to go and attack people. I mean, it didn't help Sarah Everard. I mean, the police officer there was a bloke in a police uniform murdering someone. People can abuse rules and laws, but if men want to enter loos and attack people, they can. The doors are open. And I don't know of, very many, if any, actual convictions of actual trans people, rather than people who have been labelled as trans afterwards. I mean, you get, as I said on the television this morning, you do get bad people who murder and rape and then turn up on the first day of the trial saying, hello, my name's Julie. Well, they're not trans, they're just nasty and they're lying. And I actually helped to write the bit of the guidance for judges that says that, basically. Because it's not my interest to have men in the loos any more than anyone else's. And one needs to look at the balance of rights here. If it's dangerous for men to enter women's spaces, how much more dangerous is it for me to have to enter men's loos? And how much more dangerous is it for lesbian women to be forced to use men's loos? We need to look at dealing with the real problem, which is the nasty people who are murdering and raping women. And I'm sorry to say that in most instances those are men, but they're not trans people. And I've literally never heard someone tell me that has happened and that you've seen it. Because that's it's not nice to hear, but it's good to have actually finally spoken to someone who's perceived that, because I've heard a lot of people saying it happens, but they've never seen it. And I've never seen a man in a woman's loo, except in certain nightclubs at night when everyone's using everyone's loos. And then it's actually all fine, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, thank you for that. It's an interesting contribution.
Okay, we're going to wrap up with Joan. Joan, you got a final question?
Yes.
I don't want to put you on the spot. I thought you had one.
No.
Oh, yeah, good.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi.
So I'm just bracketing off my own views about the case, because we have you here, I really want to raise this question and to hear what you would say. So, if for example we had one of the Supreme Court judges here, and they were perhaps to say, well, yes, we recognise that there are going to be a lot of policy implications, and we haven't commented on that, and that is very messy and so on. However, we are holding to our view that if you allow certificated sex to define the terms male and female, it would lead to incoherence in the provisions relating to pregnancy, maternity, or single-sex spaces. And I really wanted to ask the question because I want to hear what your response to that would be.
Oh, okay. Well, I would say, well, remember that you're a court and the Human Rights Act applies to you, so that when you're construing a statute, you have to construe it in such a way as far as is possible, consistently with human rights. The lower courts construed the one anomalous provision as having a localised meaning. And a big part of the context there is that when that provision was written, firstly, the reality is the politicians insisted on not mentioning men because it would be too controversial to think of a pregnant man. And secondly, there never had been one. But yeah, the answer is that you construe that anomalous provision as being biological. You don't have to construe the whole lot, especially when you have a countervailing provision in Section 9 of the Gender Recognition Act, which literally says, for all purposes is of the sex of a woman. Quite clear. So I think they failed to remind themselves to apply their duties in terms of how you read statutes compliant with human rights law. And in the judgment, they do not address human rights. I think they forgot. We weren't in the room. I'm sorry to say that pretty obviously got it wrong. And I know 3 of the judges who wrote the judgment. Well, no, I know 2 of the judges wrote the judgment, and one of the ones who just agreed. And one of them's known me since before I transitioned. So it's a disappointing judgment, but if judges don't hear both sides of an argument, then they will err.
Yeah. Okay, I want to thank you all for being here this evening. I want to thank everybody online. And just to say again, a reminder, if you've got any questions off the back of this conversation, this brilliant conversation over the last hour or so, please email radio@bill.ac.uk. To those in the room, thank you for your presence. Thank you for your fantastic questions. And thank you for creating a really lovely, calm space to discuss these topics. And Victoria, most importantly of all, Victoria, thank you. Because I just say Victoria has travelled especially. She doesn't come to the UK often. And Bloomsbury Institute was very much in her heart to be here. So we really appreciate your presence. And big round of applause, please, to Victoria. Thank you. Well done.